Every time I think about my presidency ending, it fills me with relief. And, you know, when I think about that, I don't just think about actually the demands and all the kind of complex things that are part of being PSI president. That relief for me really comes very much from the fact that I know that Vincent is such an experienced and capable member of the PSI. Of all the people I can think of to be handing over to next year, it fills me with confidence that it is Vincent. And I will allow him to, you know, talk to you in detail about his many years of experience and all the different roles he has filled with the PSI and the various committees and SIGs that he has contributed to and sat on. And so I'm delighted to be now handing over and, you know, over the coming months kind of properly handing over the baton to my colleague, Dr. Vincent McDarby.
Thank you, Megan, for your very kind introduction. It's been an absolute honour to work with you as President over the past year and on Council for the past number of years. I'd also like to extend my thanks to all of you who've attended the conference this year. We've almost 500 delegates in attendance, which is absolutely amazing to see. The fact that we've such a large number of delegates attending again virtually is testament to the work of the PSI's Communication and Events Committee and all the PSI staff and volunteers who helped to make the conference happen. It's only when you get a glimpse behind the scenes that you realise how monumental a task it is to organise the PSI conference, not to mention the added difficulty when you're arranging a conference not knowing if it's going to be in person or virtual. And I think in regard to this, I think special thanks have to go to Lisa Stafford, the PSI's Head of Communications and Chair of the Communication and Events Committee, who does all the heavy lifting behind the scenes and ensures that the conference always runs like clockwork. I'd also like to thank all the PSI staff for all their hard work and dedication throughout the year. The PSI has gone through quite significant upheaval and disruption over the past year, not just with COVID, but with having to move premises. Throughout all this, not only did the staff keep everything running smoothly, but they expanded the services offered by PSI to members. I look forward to working with them next year alongside the President-elect Anne Keogh. First of all, I'd like to say that PSI means a lot to me, and I'm truly honoured to be PSI President for 2022. But to be honest, I really struggled to write this speech. I've given numerous talks and speeches over the years in all kind of settings, but I never struggled with anything like I did with this one. I sat down so many times over the last 2 weeks to try and write something, but got nowhere. From what I can see, the general format of the PSI President's inaugural speech is that you have to talk quite a lot about yourself, your journey through psychology that brings you here today, what the PSI means to you, what you plan to do as PSI President. And I realised that's where I struggled. I'm not usually comfortable talking about myself. I'm a relatively private person. My social media footprint is negligible, and I don't see a blue tick on my Twitter account at any time in the near future. So I decided that rather than talk about my journey through psychology, I talk about the PSI's journey from its inception right up until today. So I got in contact with Suzanne Guerin, and she kindly provided me with a lot of old articles from the Irish Psychologist and the Irish Journal of Psychology that charted the history of the PSI. So I began reading about the history of the PSI, and what I read was fascinating. There was so much I didn't know, and I would advise anyone who hasn't read the history of the PSI to do so. From the very start, the PSI was ahead of the curve in advocating not just for psychologists, but for real social change and for a fairer, more just and equal society. I think we often forget that Ireland was a very different place 30, 40, 50 years ago. A lot of the things we take for granted now, such as disability rights or education reform, were hard-fought battles that the PSI championed from its inception. The more I read about the history of the PSI, the prouder I felt to be a member of the PSI, and the more honour I felt to be PSI President for 2022. I suppose, but as I reflected on the history of PSI, I began to see all the points at which the PSI intersected with my journey through psychology. Like a lot of people, psychology wasn't a path that I planned. When I was in school, I had no idea what career I wanted. I just knew that I wanted to go to college, specifically college in Galway, and not for academic or vocational reasons, but it's because where all my friends were going. So I ended up studying arts in NUIG, or UCG as it was known at the time. In first year, I took maths, applied maths, economics and psychology, which I suppose when looking back is a strange combination of subjects. Anyways, after first year, I dropped the maths, applied maths and economics, and studied straight psychology, naively thinking with a degree in psychology, I'd be able to walk into any job I want. I mean, I'd be a psychologist after all. Who wouldn't want to hire one of those? I mean, they bring benefit to any job. While studying psychology at undergrad, I was lucky enough to be lectured by two of the founding members of the PSI, Martin McHugh, who was the first ever president, and Seamus McLoone, who's the second ever president of the PSI, was also one of the three people present at that fateful meeting in December '68 that led to the formation of the PSI. I mean, at the time, I had no idea of the role that these two men had in the establishment of psychology in Ireland. But what I do remember is how friendly and approachable they were, and how they made it their business to know everyone's name. When I did graduate from NUIG with my degree in psychology, I came to the sudden and surprising realisation that I wasn't as readily employable as I thought. Apparently, a degree in psychology wasn't enough for employers to be fighting over you. So I ended up going on to do a postgrad diploma in software localisation in the University of Limerick. Unfortunately, I was let go from this course after 3 months for what's probably best described as chronic non-attendance. To this day, I have no idea what software localisation is. So realising that computers weren't for me and running out of options, I figured that maybe I should follow up on the psychology. I realised that a degree in psychology didn't make me a psychologist, and that I'd need to do a postgrad. And so the question was, which postgrad and where? I decided to take up the Masters in Health Psychology in NUIG, partly because it was a module that I particularly enjoyed in undergrad, and mostly because I got to go back to NUIG for another 2 years. So I started the Masters in Health Psychology in a class with 11 girls. I think I was what is often referred to in psychology circles as the token male in the class. For anyone who doesn't know, health psychology is the use of psychological science to promote health and prevent illness. And so I'm just going to pause here for a second. Now, I've noticed that in the past, PSI presidents often use this speech to make personal disclosures. So in that vein, I think it's finally time for me to disclose the fact that while I was undertaking my Masters in Health Psychology in NUIG, I was working on the side as a drinks promoter for a well-known brand of beer. A drinks promoter is a job that no longer exists because rightfully government legislation has banned it, but basically for anyone that doesn't know, being a drinks promoter involved running promotions in pubs whereby the more customers drank, the more free branded merchandise I gave them. Essentially, I was the antithesis to what a health psychologist is. Now, in my defence, I was terrible at it. At the time, all the other drinks promoters were attractive young women who were very good at getting male customers to drink more. I think if anything, I probably put people off their drink. Anyways, back to the health psychology. So, I assumed once I had my Masters that everybody would be running to hire me. I remember about 2 months before the end of the course going to the course director and asking her if they'd be running some kind of recruitment fair for us, basically where potential employers would come in and try and sell themselves to us. I remember her appreciating my naivety and gently explaining to me that I wasn't going to be quite as employable as I thought. This came as a very big shock to me, particularly as I'd convinced my parents, who were financing my studies, that once I qualified as a health psychologist, employers would be kicking down my door. So at the end of my 2 years Masters, I seemed to be back where I started. I decided at that point that if the jobs weren't going to come to me, I'd go where the jobs were. I thought, if I want to work as a health psychologist, there's no point starting at the bottom. I might as well go to the top, the World Health Organization in Geneva. Surely they'd jump at the chance to hire me. All I needed to do was knock at their door. As it turned out, my friend's sister worked as an admin in the WHO, so surely she could get me an introduction. So naively, I booked a one-way flight to Geneva and changed the little money I had into Swiss francs. The evening before I was due to fly out to Geneva, I got a phone call from Western Care Association in Castlebar offering to sponsor me to start clinical training on the PSI's clinical diploma. I had actually interviewed for the place 2 weeks previously, and if I'm being honest, I hadn't heard of the PSI diploma and I didn't really know what I was interviewing for. I applied for the post after my mother saw an ad in the paper and told me to apply because it was only 20 minutes up the road. To this day, I have no idea why they offered me the place, but I can't help but think being from up the road didn't hurt. So I had a choice of either going to Geneva and probably ending up photocopying for the WHO, or moving to Castlebar and starting clinical training. So Castlebar it was. And starting clinical training was a real eye-opener for me. I'd never seen psychologists working in an applied setting before, and I was amazed by their skill, their compassion, their dedication. I remember sitting in psychology team meetings in awe and hugely intimidated by the people around me. I got to learn from so many brilliant psychologists who were always so generous with the time. Eamon Smith in particular was a huge influence on me. He epitomised everything that a psychologist could and should be and what I wanted to be. It was also during this time that I started to experience the PSI, not just through the PSI's clinical diploma I was undertaking, which was run and overseen by a committee of extremely dedicated volunteers, but also through the PSI Annual Conference that I just started attending. For me, this was always a highlight of the year and an opportunity to catch up with other psychologists that I only ever got to see at the conference. When I finished clinical training for the first time in my life, I was actually employable, much to my parents' relief, and much to their horror. A year after qualifying, I decided to leave psychology and go travelling around the world indefinitely. My journeys took me through Africa, Asia, South America, North America, Australia, and eventually New Zealand, where I decided to wait for a while because I got a job as an extra on the movie King Kong, which was being filmed there at the time. Once my short movie career ended, I found myself looking for work, and so took up a job as a psychologist in a local hospital. I was there for about a year and a half when I got an email from the PSI about a local health psychology post in Loughlinstown Hospital in Dublin. It sounded interesting, so I moved back to Ireland, and more specifically to Dublin, to take up the post. And believe me, coming from Mayo, moving to Dublin was a bigger culture shock than moving to the other side of the planet. On my first week in Dublin, I accidentally drove my car into the James's Hospital Lewis stop. It was when I moved to Dublin that I started to get more engaged with the PSI. My first real introduction to the PSI was when I replied to an ad that Brendan Rooney placed in the Irish Psychologist, looking for people interested in joining a new special interest group in media art and cyber psychology, what essentially became SIGMAC. I mean, my connection to media art or cyber psychology was tenuous at best, but I wanted to join the group because it sounded different and cool. And I remember going along to the inaugural meeting of SIGMAC, and it was what I can only describe as a ragtag group of psychologists of every type and flavour, but full of enthusiasm. I remember coming away thinking that this was brilliant. There was a real sense of belonging there. It was like everyone was coming from a different area of psychology, but everyone had something to contribute. I suppose prior to that, I hadn't given much thought to other areas of psychology outside of my direct work. And it was like there was a whole other world of psychology and psychologists out there, and PSI was the gateway into it. It was as a result of my involvement with SIGMAC that I decided to join PSI Council. On the day I got elected to council, I was informed to my shock that I was the new PSI treasurer. It turned out that through some cross channels, PSI Council had been informed that I had some sort of financial background and was coming on to council specifically to take the role of treasurer. The fact of being on council was daunting enough, but being told that I was now in charge of the society's finances was too much for me, particularly given that at the time I couldn't even balance my own bank account. Thankfully, when I explained that I wasn't the financial whiz that they were expecting, I was let off the hook. Over the 8 years that I've been on council, I've been membership secretary, I've been honorary secretary, I've sat on the governance group, the communication and events group, the science and public policy group, and I've been involved in numerous different working parties. So I like to think that it's given me a good degree of insight into how the PSI operates, and also the changes that have occurred within the PSI over those years. One thing I can say is that the PSI now is very different from the PSI when I joined council 8 years ago. But reading through the history of the PSI, I can see that that's not unusual. The PSI has always been in flux. It's always changing and evolving. Sometimes change comes from internal pressures, and sometimes the change comes from external pressures. Some changes have been for the best, some not. All organisations like PSI go through change, And ever so often, some organisations go through periods of rapid change. And I believe that the PSI is going through one of those periods of rapid change now. And this makes it a really exciting time to be involved with the PSI. In the past 2 years, we've seen membership numbers go from just under 3,000 to over 4,000 and counting today. This is a phenomenal growth in membership over a short period of time by anyone's standards. But we're not just seeing an increase in overall membership numbers, we're also seeing a lot more engagement by members within the PSI. Almost every division and special interest group have seen their membership numbers increase month on month. And the number of events the division and special interest groups are organising have increased significantly. Divisions and special interest groups used to run on average 40 events per year. So far this year alone, they've organised 98, more than the 2 previous years combined. We've also seen the creation of 4 new special interest groups this year, with a 5th in the pipeline. So why are we seeing such an increase in membership numbers and membership engagement lately? Well, I suppose, like anything, it's not one single reason, but I think a lot of credit has to go to the PSI staff, and in particular to the new PSI CEO, Shane Kelly. Shane and the staff have done a huge amount to listen to what members want and to make it easier for members to engage with the PSI. Credit also has to go to the previous presidents and councils who made some very bold decisions about the direction of the PSI. But most importantly, credit has to go to you, the members. At the end of the day, PSI is all about the members. If you lose sight of that, you lose sight of what the PSI is. I think, or at least I hope, that one of the things we've started to do better recently is listen to you, the members. Most of the change that's occurred over the recent times has been in response to members. We don't always get it right, but we are listening. A lot of people have said to me that they felt really proud to be a member of PSI when it took public stances on things like the marriage equality referendum or repealing the 8th Amendment. I think for a lot of younger members, there's a perception that it's a relatively recent thing for PSI to get involved in issues like these. But as I was saying earlier, the PSI has been involved in advocating for issues like these from its very inception. PSI has always been on the right side of history, but not always visibly. What's happened recently is that the PSI has become much more adept at using legacy media and social media to push its agenda into the mainstream public consciousness. The PSI has also become much more adept at engaging politicians and government departments and being able to leverage its mandate from the members to influence government policy. As the world comes out of the pandemic, we're having to build ourselves back up again. The PSI is also building itself back up as it comes out of the pandemic, but we're building back better. The PSI has always, and rightly, been criticised for being too Dublin-centric. In reality, if you want to engage with the PSI, you needed to be either based in Dublin or willing to travel there regularly. The rapid shift to online video platforms has changed all that. Now geography is no longer a barrier to taking part in any PSI committees, groups, training, or even joining counselling. This is a seismic shift for the PSI, and it's one of the biggest changes in terms of inclusivity in the society's history. And that's why in 2022, the PSI is going to be making significant investment in technology that will support this. Now, that doesn't mean that the PSI is moving away from in-person meetings and face-to-face contact. It means that we're going to augment in-person meetings and training with technology to allow members, all members, take part. As most people are aware, the PSI moved out of its offices in Grantham House earlier this year, and it's currently in temporary accommodation. PSI intends to purchase and move into new premises in 2022. The new premises will be equipped with state-of-the-art technology to allow hybrid, on-site and virtual meetings and training at the touch of a button. This will be available to all divisions, special interest groups and members to use. Further to this, I'd also like to announce that we will be launching the PSI's Digital Training Academy in 2022. This will be an online platform for members who will be able to access CPD for free on a range of ever-expanding topics. We have an abundance of expertise in all areas of psychology within the PSI, but yet we always seem to look abroad for experts. We need to start recognising and promoting our own, and we intend to use the Digital Training Academy to do just that. As well as those exciting new initiatives, myself and Council are going to be continuing to progress the issues this year that the previous year's councils have been working on. In particular, the issue of recruitment and retention of psychologists in the public health services. As we're all aware, psychology services across the country have been chronically under-resourced, and the pandemic is adding a considerable extra demand to already overstretched services. The PSI has been and will continue to advocate publicly and behind the scenes for an expansion of psychology posts in all sectors. It's my view that the HSE's national panel system recruitment isn't fit for purpose. And I also know from our member survey that this is the view of the majority of our members working in this area. The panel system is a reductionist, one-size-fits-all view of psychology, and it isn't getting the right people into the right posts. The PSI has engaged with our HSE colleagues in relation to this, and I'll be continuing to push for the panel system to be scrapped. Another barrier to getting qualified psychologists into the workforce is the inequity that counselling and educational trainees must self-fund for the period of their doctoral training, as well as pay university fees. The choice of professional psychology specialisms should not be based on socioeconomic status, and this unequitable system can't be allowed to continue. I want to pay special mention to PSI President Mark Smith, who's been championing this issue loudly and publicly. As President, I'll be working with Mark to continue to push the Department for Health and the Department of Education to fully fund all counselling and educational psychology training courses. This time last year, Coru sought consultation on draft proposals for how they intended to regulate the profession of psychology. Those draft proposals, if implemented, would mean that a significant portion of our membership would legally no longer be able to use the title psychology. This is a very concerning issue because the title of psychologist is something that we identify with, and it gives us a sense of pride and purpose. This is an issue that's likely to come to the fore in 2022, and I can assure all members that myself and my colleagues on Council will do everything in our power to ensure that none of our members are disenfranchised through the process of statutory registration. As a profession, psychology in Ireland has a problem with diversity. We don't reflect the diversity of society at large. Now, the reasons for this are complex and they're multifactorial, but that doesn't mean we should accept it as it is, because what we permit, we promote. As scientists, we need to better understand why our profession isn't reflective of the wider society and try to address the underlying causes. And this is something that myself and Council will be exploring in 2022. As I said, I'm immensely proud to be a member of the PSI. I'm immensely proud of what the PSI stands for, what the PSI has achieved, and what the PSI will achieve. But what I'm most proud of, and what keeps me coming back to the PSI, is the people I've met along the way. My involvement with PSI was purely professional. My initial involvement with PSI was purely professional. I mean, I just wanted to learn about and get more involved in the professional aspects of psychology. But through getting involved in different committees and groups, I came into contact with more and more people, many of whom have become good friends. And I find there's a great feeling of warmth in going to a psychology event and seeing all these familiar faces of people that I've met along the way. I spoke earlier about my path through psychology, and the reality is that I had a relatively easy path. I had a happy childhood. I didn't have the struggles that I've seen a lot of other people have. I had a loving family that were able to fund my education. I never had any issues with my mental health or experienced any trauma. I never really had a plan, but fortune always seemed to land on my lap. And I know I was lucky. I always felt I had a semi-charmed kind of life. But I suppose life always is a way of catching up, and that happened for me 3 years ago. My mother, who was fit and healthy, died relatively quickly of a disease that had a 1 in a million incident rate. 2 months later, my younger sister went to sleep and never woke up again. I'm from a close family, so I found myself lost when this happened, and I didn't think I wanted to be a psychologist anymore. But over time, so many of the people that I'd met along the way through the PSI reached out to me in different ways, and it made a difference. And that's what PSI is. At its core, PSI is an opportunity to connect. I'm not the PSI, council aren't the PSI, the office staff aren't PSI. The PSI is you, the members. If there's something you want changed, let us know. If there's something you feel that we should be tackling that we're not, let us know. Or better still, get involved. Join a committee or a working group or council. I didn't inherit the presidency from the people that went before me. I'm borrowing it from the people who are coming after me. There are people watching this who are going to be the future presidents and the future councils. Now is the time to get involved and help shape the PSI you want. There's never been an easier and more exciting time. I look forward to serving you as president of PSI for 2022. Thank you.